Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, the Western Conference roller coaster. What happened on Wednesday night where the Timberwolves sit now, what the best and worst case scenario still is for the Wolves, potential first round matchups. We're going to kind of handicap all that here off the top. I also want to look at a couple of Timberwolves veterans and how they're performing lately, an appreciation for Mike Conley, and issues that Taurean Prince's play of late. We're going to break all that down on the show here today. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Thursday, everybody, and a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Locked On Wolves, along with all the other Minnesota podcasts, are now available on Roku and Amazon Fire TV as part of Locked On Sports Minnesota. More great local sports coverage 24/7, and it's free. Download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with two B's, two E's, C-K-E-N. All right, so today I want to talk about the Western Conference. As I'm recording this, all games except for a admittedly pivotal Lakers-Clippers game are completed on Wednesday night. Now, the Lakers are down 19 to the Clippers in the third quarter right now. So pretty likely the Lakers lose. I have a pretty good handle on like where everything stands in the West. So I want to start there. Also, best and worst case scenarios for the Wolves. Later, I want to get to some Mike Conley talk, some Taurean Prince talk, what that could mean for the Wolves rotation, how each of those vets is playing currently for the Wolves or are playing currently for the Wolves. But let's start with the Western Conference playoff race. So there is no danger. I want to start here. There's no danger of the Wolves falling out of the play-in race. In fact, they can't fall any farther than ninth at this point. Oklahoma City lost again the other night. Dallas did win, but because the Wolves beat the Nets on Tuesday, there was no way they could finish worse than ninth. So, like, for instance, even if the Wolves lost their last two in a nightmare scenario and either Oklahoma City or Dallas wins their last two, the Wolves have the tiebreaker over both OKC and Dallas. So there's an example right there of how important those tiebreakers are, because in that case, the Wolves would actually still finish ninth. I don't know what the tiebreaker is between OKC and Dallas. I don't know what their head-to-head is, but Dallas has a better conference record. So anyway, the Wolves can't finish worse than ninth, which means that they can't start on the road in a need-to-win two-game scenario. They would at least get to host that 9-10 game and then, of course, play the loser of 7-8 if they do finish in ninth. That's the worst-case scenario. The best-case scenario, the Timberwolves could get all the way up to number 5 in the West. That's possible. Now, it's not likely. There are 2 games back in the loss column of Golden State. Golden State has at Sacramento on Friday night, which is obviously a tough game. Although Sacramento technically doesn't have anything to play for because they're locked into the number 3 seed in the West. So we'll see how who plays and how hard they play and the whole thing on Friday night. I would think Sacramento's still going to try and win that game. You're still a couple days away from the playoffs. My guess is Sacramento's got one more game after that. So anyway, Warriors, Sacramento Friday night, and then Warriors at Portland Sunday. And who knows? Clearly Portland doesn't have anything to play for, but I mean, we know what happened in Minneapolis against Portland just this last Sunday. So the Warriors would need to lose both those games, which seems unlikely. The Clippers, assuming they beat the Lakers, would also need to lose their final 2 games. That's assuming they lost to the Lakers whenever you're listening to this, that they lost to the Lakers on Wednesday night. They would need to lose their last 2 games. The Lakers would need to go 1-1. The Pelicans would need to lose their last 2, which includes the Wolves game on Sunday. But if the Wolves won their last 2, the Spurs Saturday and the Pelicans Sunday, the Wolves could, this is a potential 5-way tie scenario, or a couple of those teams could have 41 wins. The Wolves would win a 5-win tie or a 5-way tie. We talked about this actually on Tuesday's show. I think it was Tuesday show. Yeah. Tuesday show. It's possible the Wolves would win a potential 5-way tie because they have the best conference record. And that's what the default is there. But if there's a couple teams in there that finish with 41 wins, a couple with 42, and the Wolves have 42, the Wolves have the head-to-head in each of these matchups. They have the head-to-head against the Clippers. They have it against the Lakers. And, playing out this exercise, we're saying they win Sunday, so they would also have it against the Pelicans. The Warriors one's a tie, but if Golden State loses their last two and the Wolves win their last two, the Wolves would have a better conference record, which is the next tiebreaker. So in that scenario, if Golden State loses their last two and the Wolves win their last two, the Wolves have the tiebreaker over Golden State. They would also have the tiebreaker over the Clippers, Lakers, and Pelicans if they win their last two. So the 5 seed actually isn't that far out of reach. The biggest issue is, can Golden State actually lose to, or will they actually lose to? Would the Clippers at least split their final two? Or actually, no, the Wolves would need the Clippers to lose their last two as well. They'd need the Lakers or Pelicans to split their final two. So it's still far-fetched, but it's not impossible. By far the most likely scenario is that the Wolves finish in 7th, 8th, or 9th in the Western Conference. The Pelicans play the Knicks at home on Friday night. So when the Wolves play the Spurs on Saturday afternoon, they will have a pretty good idea of what's at stake heading into both Saturday and Sunday's games. So say the Pelicans lose to the Knicks on Friday night and the Wolves beat the Spurs. That would mean that the Wolves and Pelicans would be going into Sunday with the identical records, and obviously that game then decides the tiebreaker between the two. And I guess it wouldn't be a tiebreaker at that point. Or even if the Pelicans and Wolves each win their next games and they come into Sunday's game, the Wolves still one game behind the Pelicans, that would still be for that spot, potentially the 8th spot in the West, because if the Wolves beat the Pelicans and finish with identical records, the Wolves would have the tiebreaker and finish ahead of them. Now, that doesn't take into account what the Lakers do after presumably losing to the Clippers on Wednesday night. The Lakers would have a one-game better record than the Wolves, but remember, the Wolves still have that tiebreaker. So the most likely scenario is still 7, 8, or 9 for the Wolves, but they can't fall further than 9, and they could theoretically climb all the way up to 5. It's incredible how many different scenarios are on the table. And Thursday night, there's only a handful of games concerning the Western Conference playoffs. The Denver-Phoenix game doesn't matter. Portland-San Antonio doesn't matter. There's a couple Eastern Conference games. OKC-Utah doesn't really matter because the Wolves are going to finish ahead of both of those teams regardless. But there is at least some intrigue when it comes to the Western Conference playoff race in general, even if it's not the Wolves directly. And then Friday night, there's a host of games that matter. And again, that Pelicans-Knicks game is massive. The Wolves should have a very good idea by the time they're playing Saturday afternoon what exactly they're playing for. It's just so much fun that all these different things can happen. I should also say, assuming, well, we don't know this, but if the Wolves finish in 9th, they can't finish in 10th. If they finish in 9th, then the Timberwolves initial playing game would be next Wednesday, the 12th. So 6 days from now. If they do finish, they manage to finish in 7th or 8th, the play-in is Tuesday, the 11th for the Wolves. And then if they say they finish in 9th or 10th, well, okay, say it this way. They finish 9th, they play Wednesday. If they finish 7th or 8th, they play Tuesday. If they lose that Tuesday game or win the Wednesday game, then the next game would be next Friday, the 14th, 8 days from now, for the right to be the 8th seed in the Western Conference. So there's several reasons why finishing 8th is so much better than 9th. But the number one reason is you only need to win one game. The number two reason is you get to play the 2 seed instead of the 1 seed. And when it comes to the Wolves, I think the Wolves match up better with Memphis than with Denver. Neither one is a good matchup, and obviously they're both really good teams. But it's also important to note that the best seeds in the West, I mean, the Memphis is only 10 games better than the Wolves. A lot of times that gap is much greater between, 1 and 8. In a conference. Like, for instance, even this year in the East, when nobody's been like ultra dominant, the Bucks are 17 games better than the 8th seed in the West right now. I guess the Wolves are technically 9th, but the gap between 1 and 8 in the West is only 11 games. So the parity in the West is incredible. And, I would say Memphis is marginally a better matchup for the Wolves than the Nuggets are, but it'd be much better if they could climb to, call it, 6 and play the Kings. Now, if they're 5, they play the Suns, who I think are actually the worst matchup for Minnesota among those top 4 teams. Nuggets, Grizzlies, Kings, Suns. I would say that the Kings are their best matchup. The Grizzlies are next best. I would almost rather play the Nuggets than the Suns, honestly. I guess the Suns are maybe a little more volatile, and so you take your chances there. But the actual on-court matchup in a vacuum is worse for the Wolves with the Suns than it is with the Nuggets. All right. Let's Let's take a look. I want to shift gears here. I want to talk a little bit about Mike Conley. Really a Mike Conley appreciation segment, what he's done, especially lately for the Wolves. And then we'll flip it and we'll talk about some of the issues Taurean Prince has had lately and kind of, dive into his season so far for the Wolves. So we're going to do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at Ibotta. Groceries, school shopping, and getting a little something for yourself. You're already doing it, so why not get cash back for it with Ibotta? You can earn cash back on every shopping trip with Ibotta. They gave you cash back on hundreds of grocery items from produce to personal care to pantry goods. Either link your loyalty account or upload your receipt after you shop and get your cash back. It's that easy. The average Ibotta user earns $120 a year in real cash back. That could cover the cost of an entire shopping trip, or you could use your cash back to buy that flight you've been eyeing, the game you're dying to go to, or the fancy dinner you've been craving. A typical basket of groceries was over $50 more expensive by the end of 2022 than the beginning of the year due to inflation. You could earn 2.5 times that in cash back from Ibotta, or even more, depending on how much you use Ibotta. Ibotta gives you real cash back, not points. Other apps give you points that don't amount to much. With Ibotta, you get real cash back that you can cash out to your bank account, PayPal, or gift cards. You can earn cash back on hundreds of online brands and retailers too when you start with Ibotta. That includes Lowe's, Macy's, Sephora, Best Buy, and more. Right now, Ibotta is offering our listeners $5 just for trying Ibotta by using the code LOCKED when you register. Just go to the App Store or Google Play Store and download the free Ibotta app and use the code LOCKED. That's Ibotta, IBOTTA, in the Google Play or App Store, and use the code LOCKED. All right, it's time for a Mike Conley appreciation segment. Mike Conley joined the Wolves not quite 2 months ago now, and early it was a bit more of a roller coaster. And I'm going to take a peek at his game log here. I want to talk a little bit about that, but I want to really appreciate what he's done recently. But let's actually start with the two-man lineups. I really like looking at two-man lineups to just kind of give us a sense for what the best pairings are. And I think we can glean something from those with added context that can kind of tell a story. I don't believe in really any statistic or metric used in isolation. I think there's always a picture to be painted, and certain metrics can give us a better, a starting point, right? A two-man lineup, I think, is a really good starting point for a lot of evaluation. So Mike Conley, his two-man lineups at the Wolves, he's played 75 minutes or more, which is a relatively arbitrary number. In fact, we could we could bump it to 100 if you want to. There's 8 guys that Mike Conley has played at least 100 minutes with in a Timberwolves uniform. Of those 8 guys, number 1 is a player he's only played in 6 games with, but he's played heavy minutes with, and that's Karl-Anthony Towns. The Cat Mike Conley two-man is Mike Conley's best two-man pairing in a Timberwolves uniform. It's a plus 9.2 in 125 minutes. His next best, Conley's next best two-man pairing is Rudy Gobert at a plus 3.5. That's nearly a 6-point net rating difference. Now, again, the sample size is much smaller with Towns, but you also got to consider how bad the Wolves played during that stretch. I mean, of those 6 games they've played together, that includes that miserable 3-game losing streak with the Lakers game and the Blazers game and whoever they lost to before the Lakers are all mixed in there. Yet Conley and Towns together are still a plus 9.2. Their defensive rating together is a 98.1. Interestingly, Conley and Gobert on the floor together, their defensive rating is a 111.9. What's even more interesting is that Conley is on the floor with Towns very often when he's also on the floor with Gobert, right? Those 3 are usually on the floor together. Now, there's a lot more, when it comes to Gobert, obviously he played 15 games with Gobert, and Conley played 15 games together without Karl-Anthony Towns. So there's you got to consider that as well as what those lineups look like during that stretch. But at any rate, that to me is fascinating that the Conley Towns two-man numbers are so good together. For what it's worth, he's also a plus 3.3 with Jaden McDaniels, a plus 2.4 with Ant, a plus 1.3 with Anderson. He has negative two-man numbers with Taurean Prince, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and Naz Reid, all of which are smaller numbers. In fact, the Alexander Walker and Reed minute totals are actually less than Towns. Interestingly, again, Conley's best is with Towns, a plus 9.2. His worst two-man pairing in a Timberwolves uniform is Naz Reid, a minus 18.1. Conley and Naz together in 116 minutes, which is a really bad number. And their defensive rating is a 119.6. That surprised me because we all have in our mind how well Naz was playing of late. Now, some of that was with Jordan McLaughlin on the floor. We know McLaughlin and Reed have a really strong connection, kind of at least partially forced with the Iowa Wolves in the G League and that whole story. So part of Naz's strong play was with McLaughlin on the floor, maybe some of it Jalen Noel operating, some of that. But still, to be a minus 18.1 in 116 minutes net rating wise, Conley and Reed together surprised me. It really did. Conley in general, however, in the month of March, or actually, let's do this. So in a Timberwolves uniform, Mike Conley is averaging 13.6 points per game and 4.9 assists per game. So the assists are way down from where he was in Utah because remember, like he was initiating offense there, post Donovan Mitchell especially. His assists were up in a Jazz uniform. Like last year, and the points per game is not the best, or per game numbers are not the best way to do this. But last year, he averaged only 5.3 assists per game with the Jazz. This year, he was up to 7.7 because no Donovan Mitchell. The assist rate, which is a cleaner way of looking at this, his assist rate last year in Utah was 27.7%. This year with Utah, it was up to 34%. But this year in a Wolves uniform, it's only 20.9% assist rate. He's only averaging 4.9 assists per game. And that's because it's Anthony Edwards, it's Karl-Anthony Towns, it's Kyle Anderson that are operating offense, and it's not as much Conley. Now, the scoring is up. The 3-point percentage is up over where it was earlier this year with Utah. It's right in a Wolves uniform. It's in the same neighborhood it was the last couple of seasons with the Jazz, which is 41%. In fact, over the last 2 years in a Jazz uniform, he shot exactly 41% from three. In a Wolves uniform this year is 41.6%. So Conley's been fantastic. And in general, he's played a lot like he did not earlier this year with Utah, but the last 2 years. And 2 years ago, the 2021 season, he was actually an all-star with the Jazz. He's played more like he did then, and even last season, the 21-22 season, they did earlier this year with the Jazz. Now, of course, he's surrounded with more talent with this Wolves team than he was earlier this year with Utah. If you look at his game log, remember, Conley had a couple of stinkers right after joining the Wolves. Right after joining the Wolves, Conley had his third game in a Timberwolves uniform was he scored 0 points in 33 minutes of that really bad loss to the Wizards right before the All-Star break. He had, in fact, 4 of his first 6 games in a Timberwolves uniform were single-digit scoring nights. Since then, which also coincides with the start of March. So start of March through the win over the Nets on Tuesday, Mike Conley's averaging 15.6 points per game, 4.6 assists per game. He's shooting almost 48% from the field, over 43% from three, and 88% from the line at 3.5 attempts per game. Look at his season-long numbers, Wolves and Nets combined. He's averaging 11.7 points per game on 42% from the floor, 38% from three. Those numbers are up to almost 16 points per game, 48% from the floor, and 43% from three. So the month of March and into April, Mike Conley has been fantastic in a Timberwolves uniform, scoring the basketball too. And they've needed him when Ant was out for a couple of games and under the weather and is still kind of working his way back from the ankle injury. Towns, of course, has only played 6 games with Mike Conley, and Conley's played 23 games in a Wolves uniform, and Towns only played in 6 of them. So Conley needed to bring a bit of scoring to the table, and it took him a minute to feel comfortable and to be able to do that in a Wolves uniform. But we've seen the assists go down and the points go up for Conley. And also the 3-point shooting has been so important. And I said this at the time of the trade. I made a big point about this. Conley's a better catch and shoot 3-point shooter than D'Angelo Russell is, and therefore is a better fit to play off the ball with Anthony Edwards and Karl-Anthony Towns initiating offense than D'Angelo Russell ever was. Now, of course, when the Wolves got D'Lo in the first place, not to rehash too much of this, but that was before they knew they would have Anthony Edwards. But Conley off the ball is a really dangerous thing for opposing teams to try and deal with. And, we've seen a lot more of that lately. Like he hit 3 threes against the Nets. He had 2 against Portland, 4 against the Lakers. He's had several multi 3-pointer games. He had that 8 3-pointer game at the Bulls back a couple of weeks ago as well. So appreciate Mike Conley for what he is, for what he does. This version of Conley that we've seen over the past month plus would be frankly a bargain at his partially guaranteed deal for next year. So if he plays like this the rest of the year, regardless of how the season ends for Minnesota, expect him to be back. He's got that. The Wolves have that option on him within a couple days of the end of the finals, I believe in June, to decide whether or not he's coming back next year at 14, 15, 16 million, whatever it is. And he has been worth every penny of that thus far in a Wolves uniform. All right, I want to close by talking about Taurean Prince. It's a bit of a different story for Taurean. We're going to do that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are almost here, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores and threes drained. I don't have a line yet for Wolves Spurs on Saturday, but man, on the road after the Wolves stinker earlier this week against the Blazers, the context of the win over the Nets, how important Saturday is, my guess is the Wolves will be favored by, call it 7, maybe 8. We'll split the difference. 7.5 on Saturday. That's my guess. Go check out that line at FanDuel. FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. Don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Let's talk about Taurean Prince. Now, the Wolves' rotation has looked a little different lately. We've gone through these waves of certain players playing really well and not playing well. Like we missed Jordan McLaughlin for weeks and weeks and weeks. Came back, played really well, and now recently has really struggled. Was actually completely out of the rotation during the win over Brooklyn on Tuesday. Nickeil Alexander-Walker was so good shortly after the deadline. Didn't play much the first couple of games. Forced his way into the rotation. Was so good for a while. Has struggled more lately and seen his minutes trimmed back. We saw Taurean Prince play really well before the All-Star break, like really, really well. Come out of the break, miss a couple of games due to personal reasons. And then after he misses those games, he really struggles his first handful of games back. All of a sudden against the Knicks a couple of weeks ago, Prince drops 35, just a couple of points off a career high. It's his most points in a game in several years. Drops 35 on 12 of 13 shooting, a perfect 8 of 8 from outside the arc, 5 boards, massive game. And now since then has struggled, quite frankly, once again. I would say that the offensive performance for Prince has absolutely been a roller coaster this season. He has had, he's had 34 games where he scored 9 or less points, 17 games where he scored, well, we'll say it this way, 34 games where he scored 9 or less, only 18 games where he scored 10 or more points. And the only time he's ever scored more than 19 was that big 35-point game against the Knicks. Another way to look at this is since the All-Star break, and since he missed those first 2 games out of the break, the loss to the Hornets, the loss at the Warriors when the Wolves just came out of the break so flat, the first 9 games he played in after the break, he was averaging 8 points per game and shooting 35% from the floor, 23.3% from 3. Then he has the big game against the Knicks, scores 35 points. In the 5 games he's played since, he missed a couple of games mixed in there too with injury or illness, actually. In the 5 games he's played since, 21.1% from 3, 33% from the floor, under 8 points per game. So since the All-Star break, if we throw, and I hate when people do this, but I'm going to do this here because I think this makes sense. So what did I say? 9 games earlier plus 5. So 14 games since the break. And Prince is under 30% from 3 if you take out that Knicks game. And this is more shades of early season last year Taurean Prince than it is late season Taurean Prince or early Prince from this season. And that's a concern. The Wolves need Taurean Prince to produce as a 3-and-D player and knock down open shots. And frankly, he's just missed open shots. The Portland game, the Brooklyn game, the last 3 games combined, he's 2 of 14 from 3. Lakers, Portland, Brooklyn, 2 of 14. That's 14% from three over the last 3 games. Now, the second part of the 3-and-D equation is, of course, defense. Prince has a reputation as a switchable defender, a good on-ball defender, a solid team defender, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When the Wolves traded for him a couple of years ago, they traded Rubio, they acquired Taurean Prince. I panned the trade at the time. From in a vacuum perspective, I think Ricky Rubio, and I said this at the time, I thought he was a more valuable player in a vacuum, but I thought Prince could potentially be a better fit. When the Wolves, let me rephrase this, when the Wolves when the Wolves made that trade earlier in the offseason 2 off seasons ago, I didn't like it until we knew that they acquired Patrick Beverley. And the point I made at the time was Pat Bev plus Prince is a better fit for what the Wolves needed at the time than Ricky Rubio plus Jarrett Culver and Juancho Hernangomez was ultimately what the Wolves, jettisoned to get Beverley and Prince. The overall equation there was in the Wolves' favor. In a vacuum, though, I thought Prince was overrated as a defender, and I worried about what he would bring to the Wolves. When he's been good, he's been really, really good. His defense, though, in a Timberwolves uniform has not been very good. It continues to be overrated, really by the eye test more than anything. This was shocking to me. And I said earlier, you can't take one metric and take it as, gospel. Like, that's not how this works. But I'm going to give you one metric to think about. ESPN's real plus minus, which is my favorite. If you're going to pick one metric, if you could only have one, I think real plus minus is a really good one to measure overall individual performance. It attempts to estimate a player's on-court impact in the context of team performance and try to account for some of that context, right? So it has Prince listed as a power forward, even though he's played a lot more 3 this year than he did last year. There are 75 power forwards ranked on ESPN and real plus minus. You can find this on ESPN.com. 75. Taurean Prince in defensive real plus minus ranks 75th by far, a negative 6.2 defensive real plus minus. The next worst mark is Rui Hachimura, currently with the Lakers, a minus 4.27. That's nearly 2 full points of defensive RPM that Prince is worse than the next worst defender in terms of power forwards, according to ESPN's real plus minus. That's crazy that it's that bad. Like, I felt like Prince looked like he's been a bit off. I think he gives too much ground one-on-one. I think the way he positions himself, it's like he's expecting to give ground and just kind of do his best to contest a shot, but essentially conceding ground. But I didn't think it was as bad as the metrics make it out to be. And because he's been so bad defensively, it effectively washes out what he's been able to do on offense. And he's bottom 3. My thing got messed up here. I think he's bottom 3 in terms of overall real plus minus among power forwards in the Western Conference or in the league. Yeah, that page isn't working on ESPN, but he's bottom 3 in terms of the 75 power forwards because that negative defensive real plus minus. The offense is essentially a wash for Prince according to DRPM, but the defense is so bad according to DRPM that it kind of wipes out any gains he would have made offensively. So according to like just the percentages, how poorly he shot the ball, it's been a rough few weeks for Taurean Prince. So we don't know what else going on, what the personal situation was, et cetera. But the Wolves need him, especially if Jordan McLaughlin has now found himself out of the rotation, which is like completely different world from, a year ago when McLaughlin was playing crunch time minutes over D'Angelo Russell in the playoffs. Now, it was just one game McLaughlin didn't play in, but we'll see. Like, you need Taurean Prince, you need Nickeil Alexander-Walker, you need these guys to perform better if you're going to have a shot in the play-in and hopefully the playoffs. And Chris Finch has to get those guys to bring something to the table. All right, that's all we have for you today. Friday, the show, I do want to preview the huge Wolves Spurs game. We saw the Spurs a bunch early in the season, haven't seen them really since. So I want to preview that matchup. Of course, we'll talk through like the other big games Friday night across the association because there's a lot going on with playoff implications and play-in implications. So we'll do all that on Friday's show. A big thank you to those that do make Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, Locked On Wolves is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch the show on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, The Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. You can now make your second listen to Game to Game NBA podcast every moment, every top performance, and every result. Locked On Game to Game covers every game from across the NBA with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.